Welcome to the Washington AI Network podcast. I'm Tammy Haddad. Today's episode is especially intriguing because our guest is no stranger to technology, politics, and controversy. Nick Clegg spent years in British politics as Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Democrats before making the surprising leap to Silicon Valley at Meta. He sat at the very center of tech power with Mark Zuckerberg, helping to steer decisions that reshaped global politics and online speech, including the headline-making move to ban President Donald Trump from Facebook. Now, nearly a year since leaving Meta, he joins us with a unique perspective, part statesman, part tech executive, part insider, and one of the world's most secretive companies. He put it all in a book, How to Save the Internet, the Threat to Global Connection in the Age of AI and Political Conflict. Welcome, Sir Nick Clegg.
Well, it's lovely to be with you, Tammy. Thank you for letting me on your show.
Well, we're glad to have you. You know, here in Washington, like the rest of the world, we're obsessed with AI. I'm sure you understand. And you're a brave man to write this book now with all the global changes in politics and tech. But let's start with this. Do you think that AI can help with the current immense global madness going on?
Do you know, I think AI in that sense can be put to good use or bad use by good people and bad people. I don't think AI in and of itself is going to necessarily drive world events. It's how it's used by us human beings. I tell you what, Tammy, there are two sets of people who, after my almost 7 years in Silicon Valley, whose views on technology, including predictions about AI, I generally have learned to disregard. It's the people who are the arch proponents of a technology or the arch opponents of a technology, because they tend to commit, if from diametrically opposite directions, the same error. That they have a tendency, and a lot of folk, of course, do this in Silicon Valley, and it's quite a sort of hypey place, you know, all these hype cycles. They tend to exaggerate how we as complex human beings, how our species, how Homo sapiens respond to technology. There's this slight kind of techno-determinism in some of the commentary, particularly the wildly optimistic or the wildly pessimistic commentary, as if a technology will suddenly change millions of years of evolution of human nature. I think technology can accelerate good and bad trends. It can be put to good or bad use. I think AI is going to have a whole bunch of other effects, many of which are very positive. But I don't think anyone should look at it as a medicine. It's not going to be a medicine for our crazy times. I wouldn't look at it in those terms.
Nick, in the book, you come up with some ideas of how to make things better. For example, taxation. Can you talk about that?
Well, not taxation so much. I just think that if you have this global technology, and like so many things that these great American West Coast companies have pioneered, it's a technology which doesn't recognize boundaries. It doesn't recognize geography. You know, exactly in the same way that social media exploded in use and billions of people use it around the world, AI is already being used by so many people around the world. And that's colliding with a very, very strong impulse on the part of many, many governments to take matters into their own hands, regulate things for their own country. So you've got this tension of kind of like this globalized technology. Generative AI is the latest really important manifestation of it, and the kind of deglobalization of politics and government. And the danger with that is that it's not a great mix. It means that we like to think that everything's borderless, but in fact, the internet, bit by bit, is splintering. And so not so much taxation as much. I just think in the long run, it's going to be better for all of us. I actually think it's going to be particularly better for the US, given that so many of these technologies have been pioneered in the US, to also come up with some basic rules of the road, some basic swim lanes that you can agree amongst yourself on how AI infrastructure is built, how data flows continue to flow freely from one jurisdiction to another. So I guess my book, in some sense, is a somewhat unfashionable plea for governments, particularly democratic governments, to work together on this stuff. I think there's a real tendency at the moment for governments, of course, to clobber each other with tariffs and to put up the drawbridge. I just think a new approach, a new multilateralism will be required globally, certainly in the non-Chinese world, as we try and navigate the pluses and amplify the benefits of AI technology whilst we minimize the potential downsides.
Well, who do you think is going to lead that? You view yourself as a European. You look at the EU, the US tech companies are constantly jabbing back. So who do you think takes the lead?
I think in the end, Tammy, it will be the US. I don't think anything in this domain is really meaningfully advanced without American leadership. But of course, at the moment, I understand both in Silicon Valley and DC, a lot of people say, oh, we're so fed up with all these European rules, trying to clip the wings of great American companies. I'm not making a political comment here, but it's the mood of the times to say, no, these are our technologies, we pioneered them, and we're going to assert what we think is the right way to go. But in the end, even for a country as incredibly powerful as America, the world's leading democracy, clearly the American economy is just a beast. It just keeps growing as other economies splutter. And of course, Silicon Valley is this unprecedented epicenter of technological ingenuity and innovation. But even for a country as powerful as that, and even for industries as powerful as that, in the end, they want people around the world to use their products and their services.
Well, the companies do.
Yeah, and I would have thought in the end, any American administration, whether they're Republican or Democrats, want the kind of values and the technology and the commercial success to continue worldwide. And that means, of course, dealing with big countries, whether it's Indonesia or Brazil, whether it's the European Union or India. And guess what? They might have slightly different ideas about that technology. They might have ideas about how they want to foster their own technology. And I think in the long run, the only way to navigate that is to do that through partnership rather than through belligerence. I just don't see, for instance, a meaningful partnership between the US and India, which guarantees space for American companies to innovate in that amazing market without that being done in a spirit of partnership. A sort of new approach to the governance of AI will require American leadership. This is not an act of altruism or sacrifice. It's not in any way seeking to diminish the role of the US as the leading tech nation in all of this. It's actually, I think, the way to assert and extend American values and approaches to AI beyond its borders.
The reason I have this silly smile on my face is I can't wait to ask you about what you thought after fighting with all the previous administrations, but watching Mark Zuckerberg, your former boss, and all the tech leaders at the Trump White House last week when they were all having dinner together. What were your thoughts?
You chuckled quite rightly, Tammy, because it's a big change. One of the interesting things I found in the time that I was at Meta was, well, in fact, I think it was the only person in the sort of senior ranks of the company to have been elected to public office, to have been an elected politician, to have, in my case, to have led a British government for half a decade. And yet I was often the one kind of saying, yeah, look, it's important that the company has civil relationships with governments and regulators, but you've got to keep a distance from politics. And so it was an irony that there was I, the ex-politician, saying sort of best to keep a respectful distance from politics. Right. Yet the whole of Silicon Valley, as you say, not just Mark, have all decided now to plunge right back into the choppy waters of politics. And look, my own hunch is that, as ever with politics, the pendulum swings. Nothing stays still in politics. I suspect a lot of these tech leaders will be around to see new incumbents of the White House, and I suspect the mood might change and they'll probably adapt accordingly. But you're definitely right. It's definitely a big change in the mood music in terms of the relationship between the technology companies and the powers that be in DC. I mean, remember, I arrived in Silicon Valley to work there in the fall of 2018. And I'm sure you've been there many, many times before and since. But of course, Silicon Valley itself used to be this kind of slightly happy-clappy libertarian place that didn't want to have anything to do with governments, whether it was the hippie culture or whether it was the early days of Silicon Valley itself. There was actually always this ethos in Silicon Valley that these companies didn't want to have anything to do with governments, didn't want to have anything to do with the women and men in suits.
Now they're all in suits. We call them suits.
No, they're all in suits.
We call them 42 longs, by the way.
42 long. You call them 42 long.
Yes.
There you go. Well, I think I have a 42R, but anyway, I get your point.
What do you think caused the move to really also conservatism? It's not just they're the new folks in town. It's this whole different point of view. I'm sure you're very familiar with the All In podcast. Chamath Palihapitiya, we've known him for years, and now he's there on the other side of President Trump.
I think that's wider than the tech sector. There's clearly been a very significant mood swing, and that's the way the pendulum swings in politics. It always does. I mean, there's this very strongly held view amongst many people that what's called woke politics went too far. And I think particularly around that time of 2020, controversies around whether too much content was being moderated during the lockdowns. I think the lockdown made everyone a bit sort of wide-eyed about the sort of stuff. And then, of course, we had the 2020 election, all the controversies around that. You had the Me Too moment, you had the George Floyd moment. I think it was just an extraordinary moment of cultural tension and of culture wars in the United States. And, it's a golden rule or a law of politics. For every action, there's a reaction. And what you're now seeing is the reaction. I would urge people not to assume that this is a permanent state of affairs. And in fact, what you often find in politics is that the reaction creates all sorts of problems, which are almost as bad as the thing that it was reacting to in the first place. So I suspect the sort of seeds of its own undoing are being sown right now in ways which are difficult to predict. But the point is, I think Silicon Valley, which of course is a pioneering place, but it also is very much a kind of sponge for a lot of the cultural cross currents that go on in society at large.
Well, let's go back to Mark, though, because that's a huge cultural change. And you were there when he started MMA fighting. What can you tell us about him that people don't know? And as you watch his relationship with President Trump and the administration grow, what you're thinking?
I'm not sure I can give you a sort of running commentary on the personal development of someone like Mark. It's not as if he's hidden from plain sight. I mean, he's one of the most recognizable faces.
Well, but it's such a change to be willing to step that close into a relationship with a world leader, because as you've already pointed out, it's going to last so long.
I think it's worth just taking what Mark has said at face value. He's been very public about this, certainly about his own shift in his own thinking, about content moderation, about issues like masculinity and sports. He's spoken on lengthy podcasts about that. I think on this issue of the relationship between Meta and indeed all the other big Silicon Valley companies and the new Trump administration, for Mark, as he has said, what is really important to him is that he has a strong enough relationship with the US administration such that he can ask the US administration to push back against foreign governments and foreign regulators who, in Mark's view, are overdoing it in how they're seeking to prescribe the behavior of Meta. And I think you hear the same thing from Tim Cook and you hear the same thing from Sundar Pichai about Google. And they often, of course, have the Brussels bureaucrats in their sights. So I think this coming together of Silicon Valley and the new administration is in part a coming together against foreign interests which they feel are not serving their interests best. One of the interesting things about that is that, of course, in doing so, and of course this is unwitting, they wouldn't have done this deliberately, but in doing so, they do become somewhat vulnerable to the accusation that they're doing exactly what people used to accuse the Chinese tech industry of doing, of getting too close to political power and taking a cue on what to do from the powers that be in Beijing. So as a non-Chinese and a non-American, but very interested observer in all of this, sitting here in Europe, and you see these two great giant powers now going head to head in the race to dominate AI, it's very interesting to see how they're both doing that by having politicians and technologists working in harness together than I can certainly remember in my lifetime. And I think that's one of the things that united a lot of those people around that dinner table in the White House that you referred to earlier, Tammy, which is they're all united in wanting to win the race against China.
Are you worried about that? Because in the book you talk about politics no, policy yes.
My strong instinct, but only time will tell whether my instinct is right, is that there is a somewhat unspoken assumption that the US will prevail in the race to dominate AI against China in a way not wholly dissimilar to the way the US led rivalry against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In other words, that you could outspend them, outmuscle them, out-innovate them, and there'll be a sort of Berlin Wall moment where a sort of triumph will crystallize. I just don't think it's going to be like that at all. I was looking just this morning at the leaderboard, which lists all the different and very versatile features and characteristics of the different AI models. When it comes to open source models, not so much the proprietary and closed models, where I think the US models still have a discernible, if narrow, lead, but in the open source models, the Chinese are now leading and clearly and consistently leading over quite some time. That is very significant. That means the world's largest autocracy is, here's the irony, doing more than anyone else to actually make it freely available. You could say to democratize access to that technology for people who want to use that technology in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. So I think that is a really interesting insight into how much more complex this battle is. China is an immensely sophisticated technology power of its own right. They have some of the most gifted computer and data and AI scientists on the planet. In fact, many of them make their way to Silicon Valley to find fame and fortune there. But I think this idea that lurks in a somewhat unspoken way that America can win, as I say, by just delivering one day a kind of knockout blow. And I don't know that one of those big labs, one of those big hyperscalers will suddenly announce that late one night, they identified AGI, they identified superintelligence, and they've put it in a box and they've locked it, they've got the key, and they're going to basically be able to dictate terms to the rest of the world. I just don't think it's going to turn out like that.
So what should the rest of the world do? I mean, you had to be nervous when you saw Xi with Modi. Then you had to be really nervous because that combo platter there of world leaders put Putin aside on the technology side.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm sure you've spoken to folk in DC about this, but I'm assuming that photo and that visit of Modi to Beijing and the very, very public kind of coming together of Xi Jinping and Modi, that should send shivers down the spine of everyone at the State Department and the White House. And honestly, if that was an effect of how this administration has been dealing with Modi, it spectacularly backfired because they appear to have deliberately or otherwise, driven the world's largest democracy into the hands of the world's largest autocracy. That's not the kind of people you want to line up against because India, I'd almost call India the swing vote.
Used to be. Maybe it's not anymore.
Well, I was going to say, actually, I think it is a swing vote in terms of how the global internet is going to develop. If India seeks to, in effect, emulate the Chinese approach to the internet, which is, sealing off the country from the rest of the world, heavily surveilling its citizens, controlling everything in a very top-down way, but still at the same time fostering an immense amount of scientific and commercial prowess. So if the Indians go in that direction, rather than in this sort of American-led, what used to be called Western direction, much more open, much more concerned also about privacy and data rights and free markets and so on, that would be disastrous for the world if India was increasingly pushed into China. So I think of the many events that I've, like you, been following with interest in recent weeks and months, I think that pilgrimage by Modi to Xi Jinping was possibly one of the most significant ones. And I hope that folk in the White House and State Department have learned that they've got to do a lot better to try and keep India, if you like, on side.
I'm going to go back to Europe. What do tech companies not get about European tech regulators? It's a constant back and forth. You think you have unique knowledge. You've been in the middle of so much of it. Is there something you would say, hey guys, hey hyperscalers, this is really what you should be doing with Europe?
I think the hyperscalers are, of course, entirely entitled to grumble about this regulation or that law. I'm very happy to get into the details. I think some of the provisions on the European Statute Book are fine. Others are well-intentioned but very badly implemented and so on. And that, in a sense, is not surprising. It's not surprising that these very big global companies don't like having these regulators right in the middle of their business. The one thing that I think is somewhat misjudged is the following. Is if you look at the relationship, the economic relationship between the US and the EU, and the EU has very significant economic problems, but it's still a very large market of whatever it is, almost 500 million relatively affluent consumers. It's one of the world's largest single markets and so on. You see an interesting pattern, namely this. The Europeans send far more goods to the US, or at least in terms of the value of goods, than vice versa. So the US runs this very big deficit in goods. And that's the thing which really has enraged Donald Trump. It's why he's imposed all these tariffs on Europe. He said, well, you send us all your cars, the BMWs, Mercedes, and all the rest of it, and you don't take our cars. You send us all your agricultural products, and you don't take our stuff. And so there's been this standoff about the goods deficit that the US suffers at the hands of the Europeans. But if you flip it the other way and look at services, that means particularly financial services, legal services, and of course tech, the deficit is massively the other way. In other words, European consumers consume huge amounts of American tech. My Apple phone just went ping. All my apps basically are American. So you've got a huge dependency in Europe on American tech. So the deficit is massively the other way. And so I'm always very surprised when I hear American tech leaders say they're imposing a tariff on us, a tax on us, because that's exactly what the US administration's done. So you can whack us with taxes on our cars because you have a deficit in goods, but we're not able to do anything to all the stuff that you sell to us.
It's very American to do that, as you well know.
Yeah, but it's important to see the other side. These American companies, they sell their services to European consumers who pay very good money for them. They buy Apple phones, they put their ads on Google and Meta and so on. And yet every time I hear the debate, it's as if no one actually contemplates that maybe the boot has been delivered on the other foot and somehow the Europeans are not able to do it themselves. That's what I think is often misunderstood in Silicon Valley, that how very contradictory it sounds to yell at Brussels and say, how dare you do anything with our kind of services exports, just in the wake of having absolutely whacked European goods exports into the US. I would always urge people in Silicon Valley who, of course, they don't care about the export of cars and goods and agricultural products, but the politicians do, because they, of course, have to see the full picture of how trade operates across the Atlantic.
All right. So your lightning round ready to go here on all the personalities and companies in tech. But first, I'm going to ask you about UK politics, because today, Peter Mandelson, the UK ambassador, he's been fired. Any reaction?
Yeah, I should tell you, Dan, I've known Peter for 30 plus years. We're not from the same party. I was the leader for 8 years for a different party, but he has this unerring ability to never be more than a heartbeat away from controversy. It's not the first time this has happened. I think he's resigned twice before because of the company that he keeps. And I have to say, I saw on the news late last night, I'm in London right now, the publication of these latest missives. They were so dripping with sort of uncritical affection from Peter Mandelson towards Jeffrey Epstein. The moment I saw it, I thought he's got to go. There's absolutely no way. I mean, the big question, of course, now rumble in UK politics is like, how on earth did he get through the kind of vetting process? Why did he put himself forward? Why did Starmer not ask more questions if all of this, at least then, that's what they're claiming, unpublished material was still to come out? It seems like a pretty serious failure of basic vetting process not to have surfaced this stuff, or indeed for Peter to have flagged it when he was appointed as ambassador in the first place.
It sure does. And do you think it affects Starmer, the prime minister? Will it have any real impact on politics for him, weaken him?
Yeah, I mean, politics is always the same. If you're very strong, these things don't hurt you too much. But when you're weak, these things hurt you a lot. And he's in that cycle at the moment. He's just lost his deputy prime minister last week for a bunch of unrelated reasons, but because she failed to declare or do the right thing in terms of paying the right tax on a property that she bought. Now she's lost Peter Mandelson. His support has collapsed in the polls. Nigel Farage,
that was my next question. He just made the tour through Washington.
Yeah, well, it shows my vintage. I think Nigel Farage and I were elected on the same day together as parliamentarians in the European Parliament.
So do you think he has a chance to come in?
Oh, yeah. I think he has a chance because, of course, Nigel Farage captures this angry, restless mood that is being expressed, obviously, by Donald Trump successfully in the last election, but by many people, by Le Pen in France, by Modi, I guess, in a different way, in India, by Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, by Meloni, Italy. It's just an obvious thing to say. There's a huge sea change going on in politics. Mainstream parties are being crushed underfoot as these insurgent parties are coming in and saying people have had enough for the status quo. And I think Nigel Farage has obviously caught that mood. He's an accomplished politician. I don't agree with anything that he stands for. But to your question about Starmer is a much more leaden, slightly wooden politician compared to Farage. Farage loves the bright lights. He loves the cameras. He's great for a one-liner. Starmer is a much more technocratic kind of character. So every time something goes wrong, like the firing of Peter Mandelson today, yeah, that definitely weakens it because it looks like a government that's not properly in control. People don't like that.
The success of populism around the world has been somewhat laid at Meta's foot, especially when you were there. So how do you respond to that?
That's what people say. Of course, we're in a period of time, and I try and explain this in the book. It's an unfashionable view. People don't like it. But, I look for the evidence because people keep making these assertions. They say polarization is because of social media. Information bubbles are because of social media. So what I then did, and I laid out in the book, and for anyone who's interested, I hope they'll read it. I try and be as dispassionate as possible. There just is very little evidence that is true. And if you look at the way in which academics measure what they call in the jargon affective polarization, it's increased very rapidly in the US in particular before social media was even prevalent. It's decreased in countries where social media use has gone up, and polarization's often increased amongst the population, often the old, those without the college education who use social media least. So it's very difficult to claim that just because people are scrolling on their smartphones and looking at stuff on Facebook and Instagram, they suddenly feel super polarized. And also, I would say, if that was the case, then you wouldn't have had any conflict or civil wars or polarization or mass extremism in the past. And yet our whole history is absolutely drowning in examples of societies tearing themselves apart well before any of these technologies came about. So again, I think this tendency to say it's just because of a new technology is a bit ahistorical.
It's a technology that's changed how everyone is communicated. I mean, I was there not at the beginning of cable, but when cable news was at its greatest power with Larry King and CNN, and it changed how people related to each other.
Sure.
But this is certainly at another level, but we got to get to the lightning round. Okay. So I'm going to name an important figure and technology, and I want you to give me your quick reaction. Let's start with Jensen Huang from NVIDIA.
Oh, will go down in the history books as one of the most consequential figures of this time.
Elon Musk.
Again, major consequential figure. It's probably best if he just stayed out of politics all along, I suspect.
Okay. Sam Altman.
I've been questioned about Sam Altman. He's captured the imagination as being the person who introduced the world to generative AI and this LLM-based thing. It's just going to be so interesting to see whether he can keep that early lead.
Where were you when ChatGPT started? Were you surprised by it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was surprised by it. I mean, I worked at a company, of course, that uses machine learning and has used AI for ages. And in fact, lots of the early innovations came from the labs, the researchers from Facebook. And AI, of course, itself is not new. It's been talked about since the 1950s. But I think it was just this LLM paradigm using huge amounts of data and then training it in a way that then it can spit out these probabilistic responses. And that clearly just took everyone by surprise. Certainly caught my imagination. I use ChatGPT a lot, but it's just going to be so interesting to see whether in this technology, an early lead secures you a permanent lead. I think the jury's out on whether that's going to be the case or not.
Did you ever meet Alexander Wang, who Mark Zuckerberg just hired to run Superintelligence Lab? What's your take on him?
Yeah, I met him a number of times. He's incredibly personable, which is not always the case in Silicon Valley. He's got great IQ and great EQ as far as I could see. He was good at the schmoozing. I remember he and I were together at a event, must have been towards the beginning of this year, at the big Paris summit.
Oh, yeah, that was great. I was there.
Oh, you were there, Tammy, right? Well, you remember.
I was there. I was at the Elysee Palace, never to be invited back again. So I have to keep mentioning it. I was going to ask you, are you going to be involved in the India AI Summit? I think you should talk about what you mentioned in the book and your ideas there.
Well, I'd love to. The invitation must have been lost in the post.
I don't think they're out yet, especially with what's going on.
Well, we won't take this then as a diplomatic nudge. If anyone's listening who's in charge.
That's right. Okay, Dario Amodei.
Oh, I think Dario's very thoughtful guy. I really like the way Dario worries aloud about the responsibility of being a pioneer in this space. And obviously, he left with his colleagues OpenAI in the first place because he was worried about the safety aspects and the downsides of AI. And he felt that OpenAI was not attentive enough to that. And I have a personal hunch that because a lot of the people who say, oh, you shouldn't worry about AI downsides, they're just doomers, they're just being gloomy, they just want to welcome regulation. And they often have Dario in their sights and they dismiss him as a doomer. And sure, maybe he kind of overstates his case sometimes. I certainly think he has done in the past. I suspect it'll actually do him quite a lot of good in the long run, because in the long run, people want to use these powerful technologies from companies who they feel are trying to do it responsibly. I actually think it could be quite commercially useful for them too. So I think he's an interesting figure and a compelling one.
And what do you think of the effective altruism movement and its role in AI?
The effective altruism movement, I don't know too much about it, but I certainly think in the early days after ChatGPT first emerged, there was I'm certainly not laying this at the feet of effective altruists, and they would be rightly annoyed if I were to suggest that I'm doing so. But I think there was this, and this is not new. Every new technology leads almost like night follows day to a pessimistic hype cycle of concern and fear, whether it's the bicycle, the radio, email. The newspapers immediately are flooded with horror stories about what these technologies could do. And again, I describe the history of that in the book. It's really both interesting and almost amusing to see that right down to the adjectives and adverbs that were used about the bicycle, for instance, and the dangers of the bicycle, particularly to women, is just almost unerringly similar to some of the early sort of doom hype and gloom hype that greeted the ChatGPT. So I think in as much as they were kind of part of all of that, I think they overdid that. And it's a bit like our conversation earlier, Tammy. You get these pendulum swings from excessive optimism to excessive pessimism. And I think the trick for everyone in government and industry is to try and get the balance right.
That's for sure. Okay, one more, Larry Ellison.
Well, look at that. He's the older, quiet guy who makes no noise and suddenly beats them all in the stakes of being the richest man on the planet.
One of President Trump's longest supporters and top supporters. And he just got Paramount. And I think he may get TikTok. What do you think?
I don't know. I don't have any insight into that. I don't know him. He funds a huge research outfit here at Oxford University, which is a very significant investment in science here in the UK. So I sort of know about that a bit. I just think it's interesting, the style with which he's done it. He doesn't go and shout on tech bro podcasts. He doesn't beat his chest and make sort of Olympian claims about running everything because he's been around the block several times. I just think he's just obviously extremely effective and smart businessman who, whatever else you think about him, has just branched out or succeeded in a very different style to many of his other competitors.
Did you ever worry about the fact that all the hyperscalers, you were working for Meta with one of the leaders, if not the leader, they're talking to each other, deciding who gets the GPUs, deciding who gets the cloud, that it's not governments that run the world, it's really the private tech companies?
Well, you know what? I don't even think governments run the world. I actually have a kind
Is it bankers? Well, I think it's one of the three.
No, it's not the bankers. I think the world is way more chaotic than that. I hate the idea that anyone was in charge. I don't want my kids to grow up in a thing where either an individual or a cabal of individuals run everything. That's the definition of freedom, is that no one runs everything. I think there is just this issue that the physics of AI is very centralizing. It's just hugely expensive. You need a huge amount of money, data, GPUs, energy, water, you name it. So there are only very few entities on Earth who can build the stuff in the first place at the sort of foundation layer. So it has a centralizing effect. And that's the power paradox. These technologies empower you and me and everybody else listening to this podcast. At the same time, it aggregates and concentrates a huge amount of additional power in the hands of a very small number of, well, they're all men on the West Coast. And that's a real paradox. And I think that's something that over time, regulators and governments will always want to watch, because it's an irony, isn't it? It empowers us, but it also aggregates a huge amount of power to them.
All right. One final question. Will you run for office again?
Absolutely no plans to do so. One of the many things that is much better in the US than the UK is if you stand for office, things go wrong, as they often do in politics. The voters get fed up with you. They spit you out. The great thing in the US is you've got this wonderful culture of giving people second, third, fourth, fifth chances. You're a very forgiving people like that. You know, the whole comeback kids thing is just a wonderful kind of Hollywood narrative. The UK is a slightly older, more cynical, jaded place. Once you're political roadkill, they just want to sort of forget that you ever stood up in the first place. It's not really done in UK politics very much. And I was very lucky. I had almost 20 years in elected office. I ran a coalition government for 5 years. I'm very proud of what I did, but I think that's probably something which now remains firmly in my past.
How to Save the Internet, the Threat to Global Connection in the Age of AI and Political Conflict. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for being with us on the Washington AI Network.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Washington AI Network podcast. Be sure to subscribe and join the conversation. The Washington AI Network is a bipartisan forum bringing together the top leaders and industry experts to discuss the biggest opportunities and the greatest challenges around AI. The Washington AI Network podcast is produced and recorded by Haddad Media. Thanks for listening.